unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milind Vaishnav. The conventional history of liberalism in India typically begins with the British. Indian thinkers are often depicted as encountering liberal ideas through colonial institutions, adapting them to local conditions, and eventually turning them against the Raj. But a new book, The Birth of Indian Liberalism, Mama Parmanand's Letters to an Indian Raja, recovers an older tradition of Indian liberal thought through a remarkable work first published in 1891 and then largely forgotten for more than a century. Parmanand argued that India's native rulers should embrace constitutional government, cultivate liberal values, and liberate their subjects from oppressive customs, social hierarchies, and arbitrary state power. His liberalism was distinctive insofar as it was skeptical of both British domination and princely despotism. To talk more about his life, the rediscovery of his letters, and what they tell us about the origins of Indian liberalism, Rahul Sagar joins me on the show this week. Rahul is the Global Network Associate Professor of Political Science at NYU Abu Dhabi and a leading scholar of modern Indian political thought. He's previously taught at Princeton University and Yale and U.S. College. He is the author or editor of several books, including To Raise a Fallen People and The Progressive Maharaja. I am pleased to welcome him back to the show for the third time. Rahul, congrats on yet another book, and thanks for taking the time.
Hey, Milind. Thanks so much for having me. It's a delight to be back.
So I want to start with the origin story of this book. And as you note in the preface, you have spent a long time in the archives digging up a ton of stuff for various other projects that we've spoken about on the show before. But during one outing in the archives, you stumble upon a mention of an 1891 tract called Letters to an Indian Raja from a Political Recluse. Tell us about sort of what piqued your interest in this book and your first reaction when you finally laid eyes on a copy.
Yep. As you know, I've been interested in the native states for quite some time. And in the process of examining the Maharajas and their courts and their intellectual milieu, I happened to come across the reading lists of the Maharajas, particularly of Mysore, Kolhapur, and Baroda. And as I was going through these reading lists, I found this work, Letters to an Indian Raja from a Political Recluse. And my initial reaction was one that was skeptical. And that was because between the 1850s, 1860s, all the way up till about 1900, for about that half century, there was a series of little texts that were written for Maharajas, often by officials in their court, that were a sort of assemblage of really odd assemblages of facts, figures, quotations, aphorisms, citations and quotations from famous books and speeches. And these were meant to sort of introduce Maharajas to a wide array of information. You might get something from the Vedas, then you might get something in Sanskrit, you might get something from, if it was the South, the Tirukkural, you'd get something from Gladstone's speeches, maybe something from George Washington, extracts from the British, from the 1857 Queen Victoria Proclamation. And all of these were meant to give a young Maharaja an account of some of the major intellectual events in past generations, in the past couple of hundred years, or in some cases, thousands of years. These sorts of texts were never very widely circulated or read. Sometimes they were written for Maharajas, but never read by them. And I was hoping that when I found this text called Letters to an Indian Raja from a Political Recluse, it was not going to be one of those. It was not going to be one of these letters about how they should conduct their day and when they should bathe and when they should eat and procreate and all of these sorts of strange, archaic bits of advice. I was able to find a copy, and it had recently been digitized by Google, and no one seemed to have ever cited it or looked at it. And so that actually made me more skeptical or more worried had I found something that no one had cited because it was of no interest to anyone. When I began reading it, it quickly became clear that this was someone special, that they had ideas that were not just little bits and pieces or even ideas that were grand, but they had ideas that were systemic. There was a whole vision, a whole piece, and whole account of how politics in the native states ought to be structured, what its weaknesses and strengths were, where its great deficiencies were, and what had allowed the British to overcome the native states and how they could regain and, in fact, as the letters say, go ahead of British India. So having looked at that digital copy, I, of course, wanted to see the actual original. There were only 3 copies remaining. I was able to get one, and that took a while because I wanted to make sure that the digitization had not missed important bits of information because there was no evidence. Who was this political recluse? And so I wanted to look for little tidbits, any little stray remarks, library markings, anything that might let me know who had written it. But my first reaction was, this is a remarkable piece of work.
Parmanand was, I guess, as the title of his masterpiece would suggest, something of a recluse. In the extensive introduction, which is just remarkable to read because you really get a sense of the man, you walk us through his life from, literally his earliest years to his final days before his death. For those who have never read about him, have never heard about him, tell us a little bit about who Parmanand was and, why in the kind of broader scope of India and, what we think of kind of constitutional liberal government in India, why did he matter?
Narayan Mahadev Parmanand is a mystery to most Indians, and he was a mystery to me, as I was saying when I first found the text. He always wrote throughout his life, either with no name at all, so he wrote anonymously, or in a few instances, the most famous one being, of course, Letters to an Indian Raja, he wrote under a pseudonym. And I will explain maybe further on why he went through this elaborate self-effacement process, but it was conscious, it was deliberate, and it had the inadvertent or unfortunate effect for our generation or subsequent generations that they had very little idea of how remarkable this individual was and all that he had accomplished over the course of his life. So who was Narayan Mahadev Parmanand? Well, let me tell you 4 or 5 things about him that really stand out over the course of his life. The first is he's Maharashtrian or Maratha and not Bengali, which is a surprise to people often when they start to think about 19th century India. When they think about liberalism in India, they will instinctively turn towards Bengal. And one of the first things just his name alone tells us is there must be something wrong in what we're thinking, that the history of liberalism in India was much wider than we realize. The second thing, which is really linked to this, is that Parmanand was a middle caste and what we would today maybe call a lower middle class individual. He was not one of the Bhadralok. He didn't come from a landed family. He was not a zamindar. He was not wealthy. He did not belong to networks that eased his way through life. Instead, he was not orphan. He lost his father at the age of 2. His father he belongs to a trading caste. His father had a small shop in a native state called Savantwadi, which is a well-known, prominent, but small native state. And once the Marathas came under the East India Company, there were a series of insurgencies and violent mutinies and little revolts that led to the family being it was a simple family, being impoverished. And after his father passed away when he was 2, Parmanand's mother raised him till he was 10 and then sent him off to Bombay, where his sister was. So that brings us to the third distinctive thing about Parmanand, which is that he receives an English education quite early on. In fact, he's the first generation to pass through Elphinstone College. And when he graduates in 1859, 1860, he is one of the first 7 graduates. So he's what's known as one of the Sapt Rishis, one of the 7 stars of Elphinstone. So he's a self-made man. And that's the fourth thing I will say. He's a self-made man who doesn't have benefactors, doesn't have wealth or backing, but makes his way through Elphinstone on the basis of, or makes his way into and through Elphinstone on the basis of his merit. He performs brilliantly. He's always in the top 2 or 3. And the only reason he's not number 1 often is because he has such incredible friends that surround him. His best friends are R.G. Bhandarkar and M.G. Ranade And a little bit later, K.T. Telang, who's not his immediate contemporary, Telang actually ends up becoming a student of his, but they compete for other things later in life, all friendly competition. So Parmanand is from Maharashtra, from a middle caste, lower middle class background, who makes his way into Elphinstone. And the last thing I'll say to you about him is that not only does he make his way through Elphinstone, unlike almost everyone else, he's a risk taker. He, for most of the major figures in Maharashtra, and this is of course true in Bengal, they're all landowners, so they're men of leisure. But in Maharashtra, most of the figures in the educated liberal elite are not landowners. Instead, they're professionals. They're either doctors, they're lawyers. In some lucky cases, they come from families that are financiers or traders. That's particularly true for Parsis. Parmanand has none of these things, and that doesn't stop him being a risk taker. He becomes the first person to become the editor of the first English language newspaper in Western India. That's called Native Opinion. He leaves that comfortable position to go and serve as the Naib Diwan, the Deputy Diwan of Kutch, leaves that very comfortable and well-paid position because he has high ideals and wants to see if he can change things in British India, goes and works in the Bombay Secretariat in British India, serves for 15 years there, takes all kinds of risks that thwart his career advancement because he comes under suspicion for being too independent-minded and for leaking information that damages the British, but he does it regardless. And then, towards the end of his life, he takes the risk when he has Parkinson's and he's unwell. He takes the risk to dictate out or read out a manuscript to aides that put their ears to his mouth, and he dictates out the manuscript called Letters to an Indian Raja, which we receive. So he matters because he's distinctive in just so many different ways, from his origins, from the choices he makes over the course of his life, to the remarkable work that he leaves us with at the end.
So Rahul, I actually want to pick up on both of the things that you just ended with. Let me start first with the series of unsigned essays that Parmanand published in the journal Native Opinion, which is a publication that he also edited. In those essays, he argued that the happiness of Indians depended on either systematizing rule in the native states or popularizing rule in British India. And I wonder if you could just unpack for us what he meant by these two distinct possibilities in light of the kind of prevailing political realities at the time.
That's right. This is one of the most important texts published in 19th century India, and it has never really been seen, never been cited. There's only one copy that survives of it. But at the time it was published, it was one of the most important documents or works to circulate India. It was initially published as a series of essays, as you correctly pointed out, with no name and with the title English and Native Rule in India. And the essays were so impactful and they aroused so much interest, particularly in the native states, that they were then republished, again with no author indicated. But we know decisively that it was Parmanand who wrote them. And these were republished in 1868 as a pamphlet, about 70-page long, which makes a series of beautiful arguments to understand which I need to give you a little bit of context. So the context is this. In 1832, the East India Company takes control of Mysore on the claim that Mysore is misruled or misgoverned. It's perennially in debt. And the promise is made that at some point in the future, a successor, a male heir, will be allowed to return to the throne once they've been properly educated. In 1857, of course, the mutiny breaks out. The company is displaced. The crown takes over in 1858, and the crown is much more sympathetic to the claim of the Mysore family, the Wadiyars, when in 1863 their heir is of age. And so in Parliament in London, the argument is made by the Marquess of Salisbury, Robert Cecil, who's at that time the Secretary of State for India and is going to go on later to be Prime Minister. Salisbury makes the argument that, look, it's not clear to me that we, in fact, govern India better than the natives do. And he points to the Orissa famine in 1860-61 that had claimed 1 million lives of the Odia people. And Salisbury says, well, if we've performed so poorly in Orissa, who's to say that we are better than the native states? And so we should return Mysore to the Wadiyar clan and allow them to rule in what you and I today, or contemporary political science, would call indirect rule. When reports of this speech reach Calcutta, the Viceroy, John Lawrence, is deeply upset and angry, and he sees this as a personal sort of insult. And so he immediately sends out an order to his subordinates, and he says, in my view, it's without doubt that British India, or English rule, is far superior to native rule. Wouldn't you agree? And surprise, surprise, all of his subordinates, whose lives and careers depend on his approval, quickly write back, absolutely agreeing with the Viceroy that English rule far outstrips native rule. And they actually published this. The report is called The Comparative Merits of English and Native Rule, and it's published in 1867, and it's one of the first major reports published by British India after the mutiny. Parmanand, who's a very level-headed, even-tempered person, reads this report, and for one of the few times in his life, he gets really upset. He says it's outrageous on 2 counts. First, no Indian has actually been asked about whether they are happier or whether they think one rule or the other is better. And second, and perhaps more egregiously, just as a matter of logic, what the Viceroy and his officers have done is look at every flaw in the native states, of which there are many, Parmanand is the first to say, but they've looked at none of the flaws in British India. And they've looked at all the good things in British India, again, which Parmanand thinks are many in number, and they've looked at none of the good things in the native states. So it's the most unfair comparison, the faults of one and the benefits of the other, rather than an even-sided contest. And so Parmanand begins by writing this series, English and Native Rule, by saying, well, here's a native point of view. Remember, his paper's called Native Opinion. It has that title for a reason. It represents the views and the voices and the ideas of this newly educated, newly empowered, rising intelligentsia. And he says, well, why didn't we tell you? Why didn't we fill in the gaps? Why didn't we tell you what you don't know? And he goes on to make an absolutely sophisticated set of arguments, as you nicely summarized, where he says, look, the native states have tremendous flaws. There's favoritism, cronyism, corruption, bribery. There's lack of rule of law. At certain times, taxes can be extortionate. The police force is works on a hereditary principle and can be violent and archaic. There are all sorts of customs and rituals that make no sense in the modern era. But the native states have a particular kind of strength, and that strength is that the rulers identify with their subjects. They, in the famous terms of that era, the ruled and the rulers are kindred. They are brothers, and more importantly, the rulers, because they see themselves as one apiece with the ruled, are sympathetic. And Parmanand points to things that subsequent scholars have empirically shown, that the native states actually invested quite a bit in public works, particularly in what was called at the time dan, or charity. And this was the thing that allowed the native states to often fight against famines, to fight against destitution. If you were poor, you would still be fed in these large public, religiously inspired public kitchens, where it was the king's religious and political obligation to feed the poor and the needy and the starving. And so it's not surprising that the native states, for instance, had fewer famines, far fewer famines than British India. In fact, when they suffered from famine, it was often as a spillover effect because of bad British policy. This was exactly what Salisbury was pointing to, and Parmanand is backing him up, that look at what the British did in Orissa and compare that with a place like Baroda or Mysore or Travancore, which saw scarcity but not famine. So the native states have great weaknesses, but they also have strengths that have not been sufficiently acknowledged. And the story reverses on the other side. British India, he says, contrary to many of his compatriots, and contrary to even some British critics, he points out that British India is actually remarkably efficient and effective. The problem, unfortunately, is that it's remarkably efficient and effective in the business of extraction and the removal of wealth from India. And here, of course, he's pointing to and drawing on Dadabhai Naoroji's drain theory. He knew Dadabhai well. They worked very closely, actually incredibly closely together. Their relationship is one of the great relationships of the 19th century that almost no one knows about, precisely because Parmanand's name is hidden. But they engage in all kinds of important shenanigans together. And so he draws on Dadabhai Naoroji's account of the drain theory, but more than Naoroji, what he goes on to show is that the British actually have all these incredible institutional, structural virtues. They have courts, they have public infrastructure and public works that are actually up to date and function well. They have invested in education and literacy in the way that the native states have not. The native states have literacy and they are interested in ideas and knowledge, but not at scale. And of course, you would see someone like Parmanand noticing this, having come through Elphinstone, and that too on scholarships provided by the British. So Parmanand says, on the one side, in British India, we have efficiency, but a lack of sympathy. And in the native states, we have sympathy, but a lack of efficiency. And so he says, look, if one cared about the future of India, the happiness of Indians, and the well-being of people that live in this area, one of two things has to change. Either the British have to become more popular, and then he says, how could that ever happen? Because the idea of imperialism is extraction. So the British are efficient but unsympathetic, but it's very difficult to make them sympathetic because that would require them attending to, as we would say in today's language, being more responsive to the appeals of their subjects and being held accountable by them. But no such mechanisms of accountability or responsiveness really exist. Of course, there's a growing civil society and a public sphere, and Parmanand is one of those people that's at the vanguard of that, but he's often ignored. When he exposes corruption in British India, the British don't always follow through. Even when they acknowledge that he has in fact uncovered corruption, they don't punish officials because that would involve them losing face and losing political capital. So Parmanand thinks it's very difficult to make British India sympathetic. But it is much more possible, he thinks, to make the native states efficient, to make them orderly. If they learn, acquire, adapt, absorb the great benefits of British institutions and institutionalism, they'll be able to overcome the challenges that had laid them low earlier. The Marathas had been tremendous fighters. The Maratha native states had done tremendously well against the East India Company. They nearly defeated them. But their fundamental problem was a completely mismanaged economy in which there was a heavy reliance on indirect taxation, very poor collection of direct taxation. In most cases, there in fact wasn't direct taxation, all sorts of inefficiencies, bribery in offices and so on, and incredibly poor auditing mechanisms, which meant there was a huge amount of waste and corruption. And all of these things meant, when you add them to the erratic nature of rulers and the erratic nature of succession, very high rates of interest would have to be paid in order to gain loans. And so the Maratha principalities always struggled when they fought the British because they had to pay much more to raise a sum of money compared to the East India Company. Their credit was far less worthy. And the reason this was the case, Parmanand pointed out, was because they were inefficient, disorderly. And so if they fixed that, they would be a long way along towards being able to actually compete with the British. And the advantage for the average or ordinary Indian would be that they would have a ruler that was both sympathetic as well as efficient.
So this connects back to something which you had said earlier, Rahul, which I wanted to follow up with you on, which is one of the things that makes him so distinctive is his time in government, right? So he briefly served as the Naib Diwan, which is the kind of deputy chief secretary of the princely state of Kutch, in what is today modern-day Gujarat. He would go on to serve in the Bombay government for, I think, something like a decade and a half. What was the long-term impact of these kind of stints in government? What impact did they have on his thinking and what would eventually result in these letters?
Thanks, Milind. Yeah, that's right. So Parmanand served as the Naib Diwan, or the deputy prime minister of the princely state of Kutch. It was not a very long period of service. He only spent a year and a half there. And it's interesting both why he went there and why he left so quickly. So most people are unaware of the fact that Kutch is actually one of the earliest states to go through the process of modernization in India. Its ruler, whose name was Deshalji, was the first Indian Maharaja to be put under a British tutor in the 1820s. And his son, Pragmalji, who's the one who hires Parmanand, Pragmalji is educated by an Elphinstonian and is deeply versed in contemporary literature, reads newspapers and periodicals, is deeply aware of international and national events. And he reads native opinion. And so when he reads English and Native Rule by Parmanand, he reaches out to Parmanand asking for him to come work in Kutch. And Parmanand has been turned down for various positions in the government. He was very close to being appointed to a series of important roles in Bombay. But after he publishes English and Native Rule, those positions disappear because he's criticized the viceroy by name. And so Pragmalji, the ruler of Kutch, sees an opening, reaches out to Parmanand and is able to recruit him. And Parmanand is very cautious. He's not at all keen, even though he's being paid a tremendous amount of money. His salary more than doubles if he moves to Kutch. He's nervous because he thinks all that he's outlined in English and Native Rule suggests that the native states are inefficient and disorderly. And the business of fixing such states really requires a person that is patient, that is great at politicking, that is great at making compromises, because reform always involves compromise. And Parmanand feels he's not really the right person for the job. But all sorts of people reach out to him and lean on him and encourage him to take this position. And he's able to accomplish quite a bit while he's there. Scholarships are created, schools are created, a new judicial system is created, and Parmanand actually becomes the Chief Justice. He has two positions simultaneously. Naib Diwan is his formal title, but in fact he serves as the Nayadish, the Chief Justice. And it's that experience as Chief Justice that makes him leave Kutch, because before him come cases where he rules against powerful interests. He's an excellent judge, actually. And he rules against powerful interests, and those powerful interests subvert his decision on the ground. So he rules for a plaintiff and the defendant, who is in multiple cases, but one case in particular, the defendant is a former member of the Darbar who makes sure that the police don't actually execute the judgment on the ground. And when Parmanand complains, both the ruler and the Diwan say to him, look, we can only make this set of reforms step by step. It's already an accomplishment to have created the court system, to have a code of law, and it's going to take time. I can't incur too many enemies or too much hatred or too much opposition, the ruler says to him. I have multiple challenges that I need to deal with. And the ruler is being perfectly fair as well. He does, in fact, face a number of challenges in trying to introduce all these modern reforms. And so in the end, Parmanand leaves. The ruler is well-meaning but forced to make compromises, and Parmanand is well-meaning but unwilling to make compromises. And so he returns to Bombay, and the experience leaves him not disillusioned but skeptical about the rate and pace of change. So that's the first thing that he takes away from his experience of government. But then very quickly, when he returns to Bombay, his even though his past of having written English and Native Rule and having edited Native Opinion, which has caused all sorts of trouble for the Bombay government because it's pinpointed cases of corruption, mismanagement, poor policy. In spite of these things hanging over him, there are enough people that admire him, and he eventually wins a position in the Bombay Secretariat. He becomes the superintendent of the Revenue Department, which is the third highest ranking position. And the experience is actually quite valuable because, one, it shows him how a modern revenue system functions. He's known this from the position of a critic or a skeptic on the outside as the editor of this newspaper, but now he gets to see, warts and all, how the system functions, and he actually learns a great deal from it. And as I said earlier, he really does also come to admire various aspects of it, the way in which audits are conducted, the ways in which for example, the British conduct audits in the way that we would think you do, by tallying expenses with receipts, by possibly, holding an inquiry or an investigation. But in the princely states, in the native states, audits are conducted by spying. And Parmanand says, look, these two systems are incredibly different, and spying is demoralizing. It leaves people constantly worried about intrigue, about informants, about being misrepresented. It's much better to have things like audits conducted formally. Once a year, at the end of the year, you tally up accounts and you see how people have performed. You give them targets to hit, and if they don't hit those targets, you ask them for an explanation, but you don't rely on spying and intrigue. So the experience in the Bombay Secretariat, and particularly in the Revenue Department, gives him a great appreciation for how modern institutions of government, and particularly this English constitutional law-inspired system, works. But it also shows him, exactly as he had feared, exactly as he had seen when he was at Native Opinion, that there is a great deal of what we in India would call ghapla, a great deal of shenanigans and underhand behavior, which is passed over, not because people don't know it's happening, but precisely because it's being conducted by either senior officials. When they make mistakes, you don't want to embarrass them, or if they're engaging in dubious practices that verge on or partake of corruption, you don't want to bring the entire British government and the British English race into disrepute before their Indian subjects. So he comes to see also how a well-oiled system and a well-functioning and a well-designed and a well-intentioned system can be easily subverted if, as I'd said earlier, those in charge, those with the ultimate power, don't have sympathy and a sense of responsibility, and are able to turn instruments of accountability away from their true intention. So both these experiences, as Naib Diwan and as Revenue Superintendent, one in Kutch, in the native state of Kutch, the other in Bombay, really help confirm and develop his intuitions on the two ideas he's had in English and native role.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So I want to just ask you just a quick question on this, which is, he eventually establishes this connection with the Prince of Baroda, Sayaji Rao Gaikwad. You have written a lot about him and his tutor, Madhava Rao, in a previous book, which we've discussed on this podcast, The Progressive Maharaja. Tell us a little bit about how Parmanand makes contact and how did their relationship lead to the eventual publication of these letters?
Yes, Parmanand's connection with Sayaji Rao is one of the most important things to happen in Western India in the latter part of the 19th century because of the enormous impact that Parmanand has on Sayaji Rao and his efforts to modernize Baroda, and then the diffusion of that example, the demonstration of Sayaji Rao's rule leads to other rulers in Western India, all the way down to Mysore, Kolhapur, Jamkhandi, even Travancore, reading and thinking about Parmanand's ideas and enacting many of them, especially things like a focus on compulsory primary education, investment in the judiciary, and having a civil service that's founded on merit rather than hereditary or favoritism, hereditary principles of favoritism. So how do they come in contact? Parmanand is unknown to us, but in his time he's famous, and the higher up you go in the world of policy elites, the more people are aware of him. And they're aware of him as an editor, they're aware of him as the superintendent in the Revenue Department, which is a very important position. They're aware of these amazing things he's able to accomplish while he's in Kutch. We don't have the time to talk about all of them here. Many of these stories are in the book, but he's able to accomplish some miraculous things for the ruler of Kutch, even to the extent of outwitting the Viceroy and the political department, or the political and foreign department as it's called in Calcutta, by directly appealing to the authorities in London. And so Parmanand is storied for the things he's been able to do to help the native states. And so Saiji Rao hears of Parmanand long before he ever gets to meet him. As Saiji Rao comes to office in 1882, at the end of 1882, and he starts to appoint individuals from Maharashtra. So Madhava Rao, his former Diwan, steps down in 1883 and takes with him this more cosmopolitan, multi-talented crew that worked with Madhava Rao. They start to disperse, and the more traditional mix of Marathi and Gujarati employees or officials start to take their place. Many of them appointed by Saiji Rao personally. And of course, these people are filtering through institutions like the Central English School, where Parmanand teaches for a while, Elphinstone College, where Parmanand is this storied figure, from Bombay and Pune, where people are reading Parmanand and are aware of him through his multiple public personas, whether as the founder of the Prarthana Samaj, whether as editor of Native Opinion, whether as a revenue official who's constantly mentoring and grooming and training young native officials who then, because they can't go further up the British ladder, move to native states like Baroda. So from all of these figures, the Gaikwad already knows of Parmanand, and he starts to write to him through these figures, not directly. He says, go ask Parmanand, what would he do about this problem or that problem? And so eventually Parmanand starts writing directly to the ruler and says, look, I have a set of ideas for you about how you might govern. And I'm particularly worried about the fact that you might be too susceptible to the kinds of advice you're getting from more hot-headed contemporaries. And that actually included Saiji Rao's former tutor, Frederick Elliott, who had given Saiji Rao a copy of Machiavelli's Prince. And Saiji Rao reads this, and, Saiji Rao has these two great desires. One is to modernize Baroda, and the other is to teach the British a lesson to help revive the Maratha Empire. And when you read Machiavelli, of course, the second idea comes to your mind first, because Machiavelli teaches you how to obtain power and how to build and expand empire. And Parmanand says, don't get the sequence wrong. You first have to get your state right, and I'm going to write you some advice on how to do this. But then, just as Parmanand is saying all of these things to the Gaikwad, a famous British official by the name of Lepel Griffin, who is turned down for the position of Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, leaves India and in great anger, angst, and unhappiness, writes a set of essays about all that he thinks is wrong in how the British are governing the native states. And in this famous line, famous at the time, he says, the idea of government has never existed in India, so there's no point relying on indirect rule. The native states have to be taken firmly into hand because the rulers are forever, even if we educate them, they are forever lured by wine and the clanging of bangles as their mistresses and concubines call out to them. And Parmanand, and of course the people that are in these progressive native states, Travancore, Mysore, Baroda, they just think this is outrageous stuff. And so Parmanand decides to write not just a private set of letters to Saiji Rao, though the letters are of course addressed to him, but instead to write and publish the letters publicly so that a wide array of princes can read them and not be demoralized by the kinds of things that Lepel Griffin is saying. And so this Lepel Griffin's essays come out in early 1889 in July, and Parmanand's letters start appearing in November and December of 1889. And Saiji Rao really admires these letters, and very quickly, by the time Parmanand passes away in 1893, the book has come out in 1891. In those intervening years, Saiji Rao has made a series of promises and public commitments in these very famous speeches of his where he basically lays out a plan of reform that is very, very close to, has very deep echoes of all the things written in Parmanand's letters. And of course, surrounded as a ruler is often by self-interested individuals who want something from the ruler. Saji Rao is struck by the fact that Parmanand always turns down both symbols of glory or reputation. Saji Rao, for instance, offers Parmanand's son, who's a doctor, offers him a job, and Parmanand says, no, that's fine. I think it's better he'd look for a job and work in Bombay, where he has to be exposed to and live up to the highest standards. And then later, maybe someday we can think about him coming to Bombay. And so he's never looking for favors, never looking for patronage. When Saji Rao offers him financial aid in his later years because he has Parkinson's and he's struggling and he still has children who are just setting themselves up in life, Parmanand says, no, don't give me the money, give the money to Jyotiba Phule's family. Jyotiba Phule, the famous Dalit intellectual who's also had a stroke but passed away, unlike Parmanand. He's not bedridden, he passes away, and his wife and children are left in a very dire set of circumstances. And Parmanand says, send the money to Phule instead. And so these sorts of things leave Saji Rao with a great deal of admiration for Parmanand as someone who is genuinely disinterested. And so that means his ideas, his letters, his advice gets taken much, much more seriously.
I mean, I just was kind of smiling the whole time that you were talking about this, because there is a letter that Parmanand writes titled On Prudence. And in it, he's writing to Saji Rao saying, I understand that you've been reading Machiavelli's The Prince, and I don't know what the 19th century equivalent is of kind of throwing shade, but that's what Parmanand was doing, where he said, it's a good book in its own way, if it's understood in the right spirit. But there's a general tendency to interpret it in a manner which has served to make the name of the author a synonym for low statecraft and unscrupulous cunning, rather than far-seeing statesmanship and exalted wisdom, which I thought was like a really nice kind of, subtweet, I guess, is another thing we would call it. One of the things that the questions that this all throws up, Rahul, is, you have kind of eloquently described what was in the letters, what the context was, this unique kind of brilliance Parmanand had by virtue of being a thinker, of being an intellectual, but also being a practitioner. And at the time, his letters were read by princes. We know they were read by administrators. They were read by social reformers, people in civil society. Yet this entire body of work kind of subsequently disappeared from view. So I guess the question is, and I know you talked about this in the book, and I'm sure you've thought about it even longer, which is, how do we understand why it remained in obscurity for as long as it did?
Yes, it is one of the saddest and strangest things, but highly, highly explicable as to why Letters to an Indian Raja, which had such enormous impact when it was first published, why it entirely disappeared. And to really understand why it disappeared, we need to understand three sets of things that happened. It's taken me a long time to understand this myself. It's taken multiple books and many years in the archives to see how the story unfolds, not just for Parmanand, but for a whole set of figures, ideas, and people both in the native states and for liberal ideas themselves, why exactly they faded from view. So three things, as I said, happen. The first is Parmanand writes this book in 1891, and then he passes away in 1893. He never really has a chance to, as we would say today, market the book as in a way that I'm doing in this conversation with you, describing it, advocating for it, explaining its intentions. Parmanand never has a chance to do this. He's bedridden, extremely unwell. All of 1892, he's dipping in and out of consciousness, and and he publishes the book pseudonymously, which means that most people, even those that know of Parmanand's great reputation at a place like Elphinstone, or his position as this revenue superintendent, don't realize he's the figure behind this book. So there's this personal element of the work not having received much attention. But I want to focus on these three bigger structural features. So the first is he passes away in 1893, and by 1895, 1896, it's very clear that the Indian National Congress is becoming the dominant force in Indian politics, and that it's committed to the ideas of popular representation, which means going forward some kind of representative form of government. It's not clear at this point that it's going to be universal adult franchise. That takes some time for that idea to really appear. But it becomes clear that it's not really going to be the native state. So very quickly, by the by the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s, it's coming into question as to what the future of the native states is going to be in India. And people in British India certainly are starting to look less and less at the native states as the source of their emancipation. So that's change one. Change two comes over the course of the next 2 decades, the first 2 decades of the 20th century, and the First World War in particular, which leaves the idea of monarchy itself highly, deeply embarrassed and delegitimized. So across Europe, monarchies are held responsible, particularly in Germany, for the start of the war, for their insane, self-important, aggrandizing ideas. And you see a sweep of revolutions, whether in Russia or in China, where monarchies are cut down, and you see the rise of socialist and republican ideals that bring the future of monarchy as a general category into question. And in India, you see the rise of those republican ideas in a very decisive way in those two decades. And so by the end of the 1990s, by the end of the second decade, by 1919, you start to see the appearance of books that say that the Maharajas and the native states are predatory, awful enterprises, and that the day is coming that they will be gone. So now, not only do people in British India have no interest in reading a book about native states, people in the native states themselves start to realize our days are seriously numbered. So that's problem number two. And then the great structural problem, the one that's taken me the most time to realize and really come to see and look at the empirical material, is that as the Congress and as revolutionary and as socialist ideals begin to really spread in a decisive way, as anti-colonial movements and anti-racist movements start to gain ground after the First World War, the British start to see the native states as their great security. So earlier, their relationship with the native states in the 19th century had been adversarial. They're constantly suspicious and skeptical and doubtful and fearful of the native states. Will these guys try and outwit us, overtake us? Will they ally with Russia? Will they subvert us? Will they engage in revolutionary politics? By the even mid-1920s, really, the native states are their greatest allies. They've provided them with troops during the First World War. They are helping them weed out sedition. They are helping keep the Congress at bay and not allow the Congress to spread. Now, others like Manu Pillai have correctly argued not every native state is of that kind. The British have an idea, as Manu's book is called False Allies. They have a false sense that every native state is with them. That's not at all the case, and I don't want to suggest that. But it is clearly the case that many native states, particularly in Punjab, Rajasthan, in modern-day UP in the north, are highly self-indulgent, are seen, they think the British will back them up and the British rely on them. And so the princes and the rulers in these states, in fact, that's why we start to use the term princely states, because the British want to suggest that sovereignty lies in the prince, in the ruler, and not in, as the earlier term native state had it, in the people and in the institutions and culture and norms and histories of these principalities. They try and personalize it. And of course, that personalization means that rulers start to have ever more leeway. And they use that leeway in the worst possible way. They become self-indulgent. That means you get rulers that are buying homes in Europe and estates, spending their holidays in the most exotic ways, going on large, long, extended foreign trips, building up, armies of concubines, using force against democratic and movements that are critical against them, labor, organized labor, socialists, and so on. All of these things lead to, broadly speaking, the native states, even though there are some wonderfully performing native states, again, like Baroda, like Mysore, like Travancore, like Kolhapur. The large of the 500-odd native states the great bulk of them start to come into disrepute. And this is despite the fact that even now, in the 1930s and 40s, they are still providing more services, more public goods to their subjects and citizens than British India is. Nonetheless, as a whole, the rulers are coming to be seen as self-indulgent. That's the term that you see most often in the press. And so it becomes clear that there is no hope that even the more progressive rulers, that their example will spread. It's in fact the disillusionment is so acute, as I write my introduction, that in 1900 or 1901, Dadabhai Naoroji can stand up in the Indian National Congress and say, we should learn from the native states. And by the 1930s and 40s, everyone is waiting for the day, waiting for the moment that they can get rid of these native states. And so in these 30 or 40 years, the sea change is so enormous that far from reading or looking up to something like Letters to an Indian Raja or looking up to Parmanand or looking up to Maharajas, instead you get people wishing for them to be gone. And so the book is absolutely not read. It stops being read even in the native states. It begins to disappear from bookshelves and libraries. And as I said, in all these instances, as we keep modern records, no one reads or cites this book or English and native rule at all once independence comes.
So I want to ask you about Parmanand's particular view on liberalism, because this was a kind of interesting nuance that came up for me anyway, kind of closer to the end of the introduction, which was his liberalism puts greater emphasis on kind of improving one's character and the necessity of cultivating capable citizens, as opposed to the kind of traditional liberal emphasis of kind of individual rights and freedoms. And I'm wondering if you could just give us a little bit of a sense of why he had this kind of paternalism, if you could call it that, in his conception of liberalism.
You are exactly right. Parmanand's liberalism definitely does emphasize character and duty more than rights. And there's a reason for this. When liberalism appears in Western Europe and develops over the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, modern states are already in existence. You have tax collection, national armies, national churches, and increasingly national bureaucracies and networks. And so the question becomes, how do you protect the individual against this large, demanding state apparatus, which is interfering and intervening in all sorts of ways in the life of the individual? And as you come closer to the 19th century, there is a whole set of other very large forces. So it's not just the state now, but it's mass industrialization, it's the mass media, the rise of print culture. All of these things are seen as restricting the capacity of the individual to act and think freely. Your ideas come to you from newspapers that are owned by newspaper barons who are far removed from you. Your ability to organize your day is limited by the job that you perform, which is in a factory, which is controlled by economic forces you don't have much say over. And so the sense that the individual is at the mercy of very large forces, the state historically, and then markets and society later, all of these things lead to modern liberalism in the West, focusing on the rights of the individual against these large forces. In Parmanand's case, and in the world of 19th century India, the threat to individuality doesn't come from these large forces. Instead, it comes from the community, from an intimate tyranny, from the family, the joint family that tells you how you should live and who you can marry, from the panchayat and the caste groups and the caste communities that tell you what kinds of professions you can undertake, or what kinds of where you can travel, where you can live, what kind of circumstances you can have, and from society at large, which tells women or those lower down in the caste system just what sorts of basic liberties they can enjoy. And so the sense that the community is a challenge means that if you give individuals rights, they may not actually even be able to use them or exercise them. That's what makes, that's why the book is called The Birth of Indian Liberalism, and that's what makes Indian liberalism distinctive, is that at its birth, at its starting point, of which Parmanand is the most important figure, there is a recognition that rights require or depend upon a background set of circumstances. Rights aren't useful or active or enabling unless circumstances are enabling. And that requires an individual to have the ability to choose freely. So if you decide you want to, you belong to caste X, but you want to engage in profession Y, which is not historically associated with that caste, well, you need the opportunity. You need a job to exist. You need to be able to be paid. You need to have the promise that if you invest in that career, you can actually keep it. It's not just a random one-off thing or not a risky venture. You need the sense that you can partake in that career, that you might actually still get married for having violated traditional roles and norms, that your children won't be discriminated against. So a whole set of expectations have to be in place before someone can actually take advantage of an opportunity. So a right or an opportunity or the promise of autonomy is not enough. And so for Parmanand, the state plays a really important role. You have to understand the value of the state, he says, because it can make all of these things possible. It can build roads that everyone can use freely. It can build colleges that everyone can attend regardless of caste. It can provide employment like Parmanand had, in the secretariat, which is certainly not the traditional role for someone from his caste. You can provide these opportunities. You can work as a librarian, as an accountant, as a diplomat, as a nurse, as a doctor. All of these things start to become possible, and these become viable, long-term, proper, modernized roles that are allocated to an individual on the basis of their merit. All of these things become possible when the state provides them and breaks the tyranny or the monopoly of society and groups over the life of the individual. And so for him, when the state engages in these kinds of things, when it provides education and shapes character, when it reforms religion and encourages people to respect individuality, individual choice, individual autonomy, that is what is the first requirement, and that's what the state is needed for, and hence the emphasis is on all those things. It's not that Parmanand is at all opposed to individual rights. He certainly loves and admires them and thinks, he himself, for example, is a newspaper editor. So things like the right to speech are extremely obviously important to him, and he often talks about them in his writings. But in Letters to an Indian Raja, he's thinking about what comes first, enabling environments that allow rights to actually have meaning. And so when we think about, to come to the second part of your question, when we think about the paternalistic elements in his thought, it is paternalism as we have even in liberal thought. There are paternalistic elements when we think about education being provided, when we think about health or vaccination or any of these kinds of things. We think that an individual may make poor choices that they will come to regret later, and that the state may need to intervene in various ways, outlawing drugs or excessive drinking or drinking and driving, for instance, these sorts of things, because the best interests of the individual sometimes require overriding their autonomy. Now, the way in which we make paternalism work in the West is we say, you can have paternalism, but it's still liberal or liberal democratic because it's authorized or approved by citizens. So in their best moments, individuals decide it would be right for us to have, for instance, a regulatory authority on matters of health. This is all easily said and done when you are living already in a society in which individuals can act and think for themselves. But Parmanand is saying the kind of paternalism that's going to be required in the Indian context is not one in which individuals already want all the right kinds of things and you just have to give them a structure for it. You have to actually convince them that this is the thing they ought to do in the beginning. So his paternalism requires a monarch, because any one person who's told, you can study whatever you'd like, and we'll provide a university for that. Well, you might not make it to the university. Your family might say a woman should not be educated. She should be married even in her prepubescent years, or a woman should be a homemaker, or a woman should not leave the village, or a woman should perform a particular role within that village. So a monarch needs to come in to set an example in how they educate their children, in the opportunities they provide their daughters, in the kind of schools they set up. So, for example, they set up a school and make education, even for girls, compulsory, taking away the choice from families to keep their daughters at home. And Parmanand thinks all of these things are ultimately enabling and will require a monarch to do it, because people won't choose to bind their own hands, at least in the beginning. So, in that chicken and egg situation, well, it very much is a monarch that has to come first for him before rights begin to make sense.
So, Rahul, let me maybe just ask you one final thing, which is a kind of meta question, right? I mean, as you step back and you reflect on all of the wisdom that's contained in these letters, what do you hope that readers of this book will take away when it comes to the origins of Indian liberalism? I think you spoke a little bit about the unique nature of Indian liberalism and the nature of Indian liberal thought, but in terms of where it all happened, what do you hope that they'll leave this book with?
Yeah, thanks for this question, Milan. I've been, I hadn't quite intended to spend a lifetime on these topics. But I have found myself now, over a decade working in the archives on these questions, on the wisdom that's in these letters. And I think what I'm hoping people will take away is really at least two big ideas. The first is that when we think about the native states in India, when we think about the arrival of modernity in India, when we think about liberalism and liberal ideas in India, that we are more capacious. The tendency has been to think about modernity, of which liberalism is an essential part, because we think about modernity as recognizing and freeing up the individual, seeing the value of the individual. It's not that modernity is opposed to communities or opposed to groups, but it sees the worth and value of an individual. And so when we think about the arrival of modernity, there is a tendency to think it was imposed by the British, and then to become critical of modernity or critical of liberalism because we see it as being imposed. And what I would like for readers and citizens to understand is that the native states played a much greater role than we have historically realized, a much greater role in introducing modern and liberal ideas into India. It was not introduced solely by the British. And the other thing is, when people don't ascribe liberal ideas to the British, they tend to ascribe them to a handful of figures at the start of a modern independent India. Take a figure like Nehru, for instance. And so then we assume that if we question these figures, or we depart from their example, or we disagree with them, we are bringing the entire liberal edifice into question. And it's essential, I think, to understand just how deep-seated, how deep-rooted, how widely spread liberal and modern ideals were in India, that they weren't associated with just the Congress, they weren't associated with just Nehru, they weren't associated with just the character and life of India in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Liberalism in India has a 2-century-old existence. It is the product of an immense amount of reflection, a bitter experience in the eyes of and in the hands of many different groups. And so we need to think, when people talk about contemporary China or contemporary Japan or contemporary Germany, they have no trouble at all in praising or in giving credit to whether the Qing in China or the Meiji in Japan or the Kaisers and the important figures of modern Germany, the rise of German nationalism before Hitler and all of those sorts of things, the integration of Germany into a single unit. In all these cases, we tend to think of these figures as enabling. But yet when we turn to the native states, when we turn to Indian history, we are far more pessimistic or skeptical. We tend to discredit or discount the native states, as I was saying to you earlier, based mostly on what we see in the 1930s and 40s, where there are these self-indulgent Maharajas. We don't think about these native states in their best years. You don't tend to think of, you don't size up an individual in their in their declining years, you think of them in the prime of their life. And the prime of the life for the native states was the 19th century. This is when they made these remarkable contributions, creating new constitutions, organizing politics, building colleges, building public infrastructure, putting in place things like compulsory education. The native states did most of these things, including having representative government before British India did. This is easily forgotten. Most of the texts on liberalism in India don't even recognize that the emancipation of the individual, the introduction of all of these basic liberties for individuals like education, like mobility, were encouraged and fostered by the native states even before they were in British India as a matter of policy and law. So my hope is that when we read Parmanand, when we read his letters, we see that there was always a recognition that the native states, please don't get me wrong, I don't want to project the native states as being some wonderful, miraculous place. Again and again in this conversation, I've tried to emphasize that Parmanand and those around him see the native states as deeply flawed and deeply problematic, but that they had the embers of modern liberalism and modern India in them. And it's the kindling of those embers and the encouragement that those native states and those rulers gave to these sympathies and tendencies that helped produce modern India. So it is very much a mutual, an exercise of mutual creation, and not one where the British or just a few handful of figures in the middle of the 20th century produced the India we have today.
My guest on the show this week is Rahul Sagar. He is the Global Network Associate Professor of Political Science at New York University, Abu Dhabi, and he's the author of a brand new book, The Birth of Indian Liberalism, Mama Parmanand's Letter to an Indian Raja. There is a ton to read and learn in this book. Rahul, thank you so much for uncovering this gem, for your introductory essay, and for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Milan. It's been an absolute joy as always. Thank you.
Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps other people find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grand Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Aizen Familetti is our executive producer. Additional assistance provided by Andy Rabina. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.